Chapter 4, in which Cabal acts and the future remains dark. 5 minutes later, Cabal was politely shooed away from the windows while the glass was slid back into place and locked. As he watched the procedure with limited interest, a steward appeared at his elbow. "Good evening, sir," he said, and smilingly handed Cabal a menu. "What's this?" asked Cabal, suspicious. "The menu for the departure dinner, sir," replied the steward. Cabal looked blank. "It's in the itinerary?" the steward added. Cabal pulled Meisner's little bundle of documents from his inside pocket and quickly sorted through them. Now he thought of it, there had been some sort of ship's timetable, but he'd assumed it was for general meals, not for anything as specific as a departure dinner. But there it was. The captain's table, dinner dress, mandatory. Cabal gritted his teeth very slightly. He couldn't really worm out of it without drawing attention to himself. He just hoped Meisner had seen fit to pack a dinner jacket. Cabal let himself into cabin starboard 6, locked the door behind him, and sat heavily on the bed. He despised acting. The whole conceit of concealing his personality was distasteful in the extreme, and he could hardly wait until these few days were over and behind him. In the meantime, however, he opened Meisner's steamer trunk and had a swift sortie around its contents. Minor Meisner's role in government may have been, but the salary must have been quite impressive. Either that, or Meisner's father was a rich man with plenty of strings to pull for his son. Somehow, the latter seemed more likely. Cabal found no fewer than 3 dinner jackets, one of which couldn't possibly be worn except on a bet. He consigned it to the bottom of the trunk and looked at the others. They were both black and acceptable, but one was cut less fashionably than the other, and this was the one Cabal hung up in the small wardrobe for wear that evening. Next, he found a pair of trousers and measured them against his leg. Yes, he and Gerhard Meisner were of a height. The shirts were also suitable. The underwear, Cabal was profoundly relieved to discover, was brand new and still in its shop wrappings. With no idea of whether Meisner was still alive, Cabal had few qualms about wearing dead man's shoes, but he drew the line at dead man's knickers. His ensemble for the evening decided, Cabal sat on the bed, picked up the thin bundle of documents from the bedside, and leafed through them to make sure there were no more unpleasant surprises. It seemed fairly quiet after the first evening, mainly optional events until a mandatory dinner the evening before journey's end in Catamenia. There was also a pamphlet about what a wonderful ship the Princess Hortense was, with a short and patronizing section on the miracles of modern science, whose very first sentence, a lurching edifice of ill-applied technical babble, made still more asinine by the addition of the ignorant hyperbole employed by the worst sort of feature writers, irked him so much that he read no more. Instead, he tore a strip from it to leave him with a square of light card, and this he proceeded to fold into an origami swan. When he was finished, and the swan was in residence on the cabin's small writing desk, he turned off the bedside light and sat in near darkness. Outside his porthole there was nothing to see but stars. The earth below lay in night without even the light of a cottage to break it. Cabal watched the world, or, at least, he watched what little he could make of the horizon go by for a few minutes. He felt deeply, profoundly miserable. He really didn't want to attend the dinner. On the one hand, he would have to spend the entire evening pretending to be something he wasn't, and the forfeit for failing to be convincing was death. It simply wasn't conducive to having a good time. On the other hand, he disliked the company of others at the best of times, and being forcibly surrounded by the well-to-do and the very smug burghers and spouses of Mercarvia intensified that dislike by a comfortable magnitude or 2. Perhaps he could plead air sickness and retire early. Then he considered well-meaning matrons pestering him for the rest of the voyage with patented gippy stomach remedies, many of which would involve raw eggs. No, he'd just have to tough it out and be distant, offhand, and generally unfriendly. He perked up slightly. The evening was looking more interesting already. The dinner was to be preceded by a champagne reception. Cabal allowed himself to be fashionably late in arriving, only to discover that the fashion had become more exaggerated without anybody telling him. There were a few passengers in the aft lounge, only just outnumbering the stewards. He was offered a bumper of champagne in a wide-mouthed glass rather than the flute glasses he thought they were becoming the norm. Looking around, he noted that the women were receiving half-filled flutes and realized that in Mercarvian society, it was the male prerogative to get very drunk very quickly. Somehow, he couldn't see the Temperance League making any great inroads into Mercarvia anytime soon. He looked dubiously at his glass. It had to have the best part of a quarter of a pint in it before walking carefully over to one of the aft bay windows that sandwiched the closed and locked gangway hatch. There, he sipped slowly, endeavoring to look both aloof and unapproachable. It seemed to work. Nobody came over to talk to him except a steward who hovered by every few minutes to be silently appalled that Cabal was still in his first class, not his third or fourth. In the rest of the slowly filling lounge, the men drank, and the women wittered. It was not humanity at its best, and Cabal was not very interested in observing them. Instead, he looked out of the window at the vault of heaven. The cloud cover had thinned to the point that there were only a few ragged rolls of stratocumulus moving slowly across the sky, glowing blue by the light of a gibbous moon. The stars were clearer and sharper than he ever remembered ever seeing them. An effect of their altitude, he assumed. Astronomy had exerted a brief fascination for him in his adolescence, and he amused himself by making out the constellations. Ursa Major was, as always, childishly simple to spot, and he felt a small frisson of childish delight in doing so. He traced the line from the top of Plough to find Polaris and watched it for a long time. He experienced a less pleasant frisson when it started to shift across the sky and he realized that the ship was turning. A few difficult seconds later, however, and it had stopped. The Princess Hortense was merely making a small course adjustment, not returning to the aeroport. Cabal just wished the damnable meal would start, the sooner to be done with. Despite himself, he felt that he was settling into the role. He pulled together everything he knew about agriculture and was moderately sure that he could impress a layman on the subject of scrapie, especially if the layman was quite paralytically drunk. Abruptly, he became aware of somebody standing by his right shoulder a mere moment before he smelt perfume. He'd allowed his concentration to slip, and in those few moments when he wasn't being aloof and unapproachable, he'd been approached. "Beautiful, aren't they?" said a young woman's voice. There was little intonation, and it took Cabal a moment to realize what she was talking about. "The stars? Yes, I suppose they are. I'm not a poet or a painter, though, so that's just hearsay." The woman made a small noise that was probably a laugh, as if he'd said something witty or profound. In a sense, he had. Then she said, "What do you think of when you look at the stars?" He considered quickly. He'd heard about this sort of thing. If his understanding was correct, he could well be in the process of being picked up, currently at the small talk stage. This could be useful. Keeping one, ideally, fairly stupid woman entertained for the duration of the voyage would go a long way towards avoiding the company of others. Nobody, as the saying goes, wants to be a gooseberry. It might be as well to cultivate her acquaintance. Looking steadfastly up at the stars and assuming an expression that he had reason to believe was dreamy and romantic, he said, "Once upon a time, it was believed that our futures were, literally, written in the stars. It was called stellascript. It was said that you should read them west to east if you wanted to know the good things in your future." "And north to south for evil things?" asked his companion ingenuously. "Of course, it's all nonsense. The stars are set in their paths," said Cabal, wondering if that was a lucky shot on her part. "The future remains unknown to us, no matter how you might try to read it. There was another technique called gyromancy, for example. A practitioner of this piece of flummery would spin around on the spot until he got dizzy and fell over. The manner of the falling over told the future of whoever had hired the gyromancer. I should think," he added with an artful chuckle, "that the true reading would invariably be, 'You will soon be gulled by a confidence trickster.' There was silence for a few moments, and Cabal wondered if this would be a good time to turn and look as handsome as possible. Before he could commit himself, however, his companion spoke again. Gyromancy. I would have thought necromancy was more your style. Johannes, Cabal. It went very quiet in the lounge. Then somebody laughed, the chatter started up again, and Cabal realized that it had simply been a natural silence and a dozen conversations occurring simultaneously. The merest fluke, or at least nobody had stuck a gun in his back yet, so that was probably the reason. He stopped looking at the stars, his throat tightening and his head feeling a little gyromantic in itself, refocused on the reflections in the glass, and just for a moment he saw a face he knew to be dead. His heart jolted. He took a sharp breath, looked again, and saw he was mistaken, but that the truth was just shocking. Cabal was not a man given to gasping usually, and he did not do so again. Standing at his right shoulder, her gaze balefully meeting his, was Leonie Barrow. It can be said of a necromancer that, given his profession, there are few people he can ever truly be sure of never seeing again, even the ones he buries in shallow graves in the woods. Johannes Cabal, however, could have said in any second up to this that the last person he expected to see aboard the Princess Hortense was Leonie Barrow, a woman he'd last seen many months ago and a considerable number of international borders away. Cabal had on that occasion held stewardship of a diabolical carnival, committed to wandering the railway network for a year, scooping up the souls of the disaffected along the way. It was all done at the whim of a bored and capricious Satan who had made a wager with Cabal. Cabal's own soul would be returned to him on receipt of 100 others, with 1 year in which to do so, and the carnival to help him bring in the harvest. He had loathed that year. Even though he really had only himself to blame, it had been a ramshackle period of travel, perfunctory damnations, and tawdry knickknacks during which he had experienced much and enjoyed little. At the time, he thought the end had justified the means, but a final, bitter irony on top of a year full of them, the end had made him question those means, making his small victories seem petty and ignoble. He had met Miss Barrow and her father towards the end of the year, when things had become unexpectedly desperate. Mr. Frank Barrow, a retired policeman and redoubtable nuisance, had descended upon Cabal like nemesis, but in the end it was Leonie Barrow who had proved the cleverer foe. Considered as a whole, it had not been a happy meeting, and they had not parted on the best of terms. In fact, if Miss Barrow had murdered him on that occasion, the prosecution would have had a hard time finding a jury to hang her. Cabal turned to face her, needing the proof of direct sight. She was still tall, still crowned with the tawny blonde hair that matched her name so well, still very striking in a pre-Raphaelite sort of way, and judging by her expression, still deeply pissed off with him. He tried to speak, but his vocabulary had studied the situation and taken the evening off. He grated slowly for once, speechless. His thumb twitched involuntarily, and the cup of his glass snapped off, dumping the remains of the champagne at their feet. A steward was at his side in an instant, mopping up and apologizing for the inferior quality of the glasses. The company would certainly complain to the manufacturers for their shoddiness. "Can I get you another drink, Herr Meisner?" he asked as he gathered up the remains of the glass. "Meisner?" mouthed Miss Barrow at Cabal. He barely responded, his mind finally getting up to whirring pace as the frost of surprise thawed. If she denounced him, the ship would turn right around and take him back to the waiting arms of the Count Marechal. He couldn't let that happen, but he couldn't see a way around it either. He calculated possible schemes. Plan A consisted of punching her in the stomach and heaving her through the window. It was direct and effective, but there were certain practical drawbacks that mitigated against its use. He didn't have a plan B. "Fräulein Barrow, perhaps you would like a refresher?" said the steward, indicating her glass. "No, thank you," she replied, smiling for his benefit. "I'm replete for the moment. I'm sure if I need any more, Herr Meisner will be kind enough." This last directed at Cabal, who almost missed it. "Of course, Fräulein, it would be my privilege," he replied, nodding and clicking his heels as appeared to be the de rigueur. A military man, sir? Said the steward, impressed. Cabal blinked. He couldn't wipe his nose around here without committing some sort of social gaffe or telegraphing the wrong thing. Not really, he prevaricated. I was at the academy in my youth, but my horse... What do horses do that is bad for their riders? He wondered. Fell on me. That sounded more than a good enough reason for a medical discharge. He touched the imaginary shoulder wound the horse had caused and accidentally prodded the saber cut that Maricol had left in him. His unfeigned grimace of pain seemed to do the trick. The steward nodded sympathetically and moved on. Leonie Barrow watched Cabal as he watched the steward go. He was leaning back with studied nonchalance as he let his gaze wander around the room, but she knew that he simply didn't want anybody else walking up behind him unexpectedly, especially when they started talking about what she knew they had to talk about. She waited. Finally, Cabal found words. "Why didn't you denounce me?" he asked, not looking at her. She smiled as if making small talk, but her voice was cold. "Because they'd have taken you back to Krenz and strung you up. That's if they didn't throw you overboard here and now. Your breed isn't popular among the Mercarvians." His gaze slid to look at her. "Or anywhere," she added with a certain emphasis. Cabal narrowed his eyes, nettled. "So you're preserving my life for humanitarian reasons. How very kind of you. I feel redeemed already." She still had the power to send him to his death, but somehow that was preferable to being patronized. "Save your sarcasm, Cabal. When we reach Senza, I'll see you put under arrest. They don't have capital punishment for the likes of you. It will be life imprisonment, but that's no more than you deserve." She spoke with a cold certainty. Cabal wished he had a drink, just to give his hands something to do. Currently, they were keen on carrying out Plan A, and damn the consequences. "You are your father's daughter," Cabal said finally. "Speaking of whom, how is he?" "As well as can be expected, after what you put us through." "I don't suppose your opinion of me would be moderated at all if—" "No, if I told you I was hardly a free agent." He looked at her. "No, I don't suppose it would, not in your little world of moral certainties." "You really do think that you're superior to everybody else, don't you?" "Don't be absurd," he answered, while trying hard to think of somebody he looked up to. There didn't seem to be anybody. They stood in awkward silence for a few moments. "So," said Cabal, fractionally less irritated by the presence of words than by their absence, "what brought you to a pit like Mercarvia?" "My degree," replied Miss Barrow grudgingly. She volunteered no more. "Your degree? What sort of degree, precisely?" "Criminal psychology," she replied, and looked squarely at him. Cabal sighed. "You really are your father's daughter. What is your intended career? A plodding police officer, the proprietor of an asylum for the criminally insane? I'd suggest you plump for the latter. The hours are better." In reply, she simply tilted her head and looked more keenly at him. It was a look that, he realized, closely mirrored his own when a likely corpse happened his way, usually under a tarpaulin on the back of a cart at 3 a.m. "Tch," he tutted. "You think I'm a criminal, don't you? One of your grubby little perpetrators from a troubled family background who commits outrages because a cousin told him horses have 5 legs when he was an infant and it scarred him for life. Is that it?" "You are a criminal, Cabal, but there's nothing common or garden about you. Do you know I decided on taking this degree in the first place after meeting you?" Cabal frowned. "If you're trying to endear yourself to me, you've chosen an odd way of setting about it. Your behavior was criminal, but your motivation—" "I didn't understand your motivation at all. Most of your colleagues—" "I don't have colleagues. It is not a profession that encourages union activity or glee clubs." "Are a bunch of shallow megalomaniacs. They're easy. I can spot a power-crazy, corpse-raising nutcase." "Ah, now you're trying to lose me with jargon. Stop interrupting me. I can spot one of those pathetic creatures at 10 paces. "You must have met dozens," muttered Cabal. "I've met a couple," she said. Cabal looked at her with surprise. Having secured his attention in the moment, she continued more sedately. In an asylum for the criminally insane, as it happens. Sad, lonely men. They took up necromancy in the same way madmen might take up knives to revenge themselves on a society that they don't understand, and that makes no effort to understand them. You, though, you can fit in. It's no mean feat to pass yourself off as one of this bunch. She indicated the gathered Mercarvians with a nod of her head. I don't see you leading an army of zombies into the fray. Zombies are so passé. Don't be flippant with me, Cabal. Your life's mine. I want to do the right thing, but my God. It wouldn't take much provocation. Not much at all. Cabal scowled. What's this psychoanalysis by coercion? Tell me about your childhood or else. I didn't realize psychiatry had become so two-fisted. He smiled at her for appearance's sake, but his eyes were sharp and dangerous. Don't think you can quantify me and put me in a thesis. A census taker once tried to test me. I let my front garden eat him. Your front garden? He wrinkled his nose. You didn't expect me to do it, did you? Miss Barrow's eyes flickered to one side, and suddenly she smiled broadly and became the very spirit of vivacity. You told your gardener he could eat it. That's simply too precious. She laughed full-throatedly. Cabal was caught off guard, but only for a moment. He looked to his side and pretended to realize that they had company. Well, he said with ersatz joviality, you just can't get the staff these days, can you? The couple to whom he spoke allowed a moment's bewilderment before laughing politely. No, you can't, said the man, plainly wondering with what he was agreeing. There was a short, embarrassed pause, during which Cabal wondered why they wouldn't go away, and the couple desperately tried to formulate a polite plan for getting away. I'm Roborovsky, said the man, having run out of ideas. Linus Roborovsky, and this is my wife, Elizabeth. They did not seem to be especially well suited to each other. He was in his late 30s to mid-40s, careworn and starting to bald, and he exuded an air of being in a state of permanent harassment. He wore a good, but not very good, bespoke suit and brown-green twill, which he looked forced into, despite its having been made to measure. Cabal decided that he was a small businessman who had unexpectedly become successful and wasn't quite sure how to deal with the trimmings that came with it. His wife had a good 6 inches on him and was younger, no more than 30. She was wan rather than simply pale, and she wore her loosely coiled strawberry blonde hair like an affliction. She had an unlovely dress in mustard yellow hanging about her that in no way complimented her complexion. She stood beside and a little behind her husband, and they looked like the makings of a poultice. They served to remind Cabal, should a reminder ever be necessary, why his social skills were so poor. People were loathsome and not worth the practice. Meisner, he said, shaking hands with Roborovsky. Gerhard Meisner. He hadn't even let Roborovsky's hand go before his wife was offering hers, palm down, hoping he successfully suppressed the weary note that would surely color his voice should he let it. He clicked his heels and kissed her hand. Enchanté, he added, for want of anything sensible to say. In his experience, it was possible to talk any sort of rubbish in a foreign language and so sound sophisticated. As he looked up and straightening, he noticed a glimmer in her eye that he didn't altogether like. There was something calculating there, and the fact that he had no idea what she was calculating caused him a twinge to his sense of self-preservation. In an instant, the glimmer was gone, and she was looking at him with the glassy expression of a bourgeoisie housefrau, or a head of livestock. Herr Roborovsky was looking inquiringly at Miss Barrow. And your friend is? He asked Cabal. Miss Barrow, however, was not going to be spoken for, no matter what passed for etiquette in Mercarvia. Leonie Barrow, she said, and held out her hand. That she held it out thumb upwards for shaking may have been lost on the Roborovskys, for they shook her hand with polite smiles and the ghost of a curtsy from Frau Roborovsky. You're English, aren't you? She asked Miss Barrow. I've always wanted to visit England, but Linus is so busy. We never seem to get the chance to have a holiday. Oh, why? What do you do? She addressed the question directly to Herr Roborovsky, but he just looked blankly at her like a rep actor who was considering what to have for supper instead of watching for his cue. After a moment, Frau Roborovsky said, He's a cabinet maker. Her husband jumped slightly like a rep actor who has finally decided to have Welsh rabbit for supper and returns to the here and now to discover a stage full of his fellow actors glaring daggers at him. "Oh, yes," he said, as if the statement was so astounding that it required confirmation. "I'm a cabinet maker." "And that keeps you busy, does it?" asked Cabal, seeking to reconcile cabinet-making, extreme busyness, and journeys on luxury aeroships to his satisfaction. Yes?" "Linus," interjected his wife with the mildly acidic tone of somebody who suspects that they're being made sport of but isn't quite sure, "is very successful. He runs one of the most respected workshops in the country." The end of the sentence was punctuated with a sharp nod of the "and don't you forget it, Buster" variety. "Running a cabinet manufactory." Cabal activated the muscles that careful research had revealed would create a supercilious smile. It was one of his more convincing ones. "How fascinating." Herr Roborovsky beamed a happy hamster. His wife did not. "What do you do, Herr Meisner?" "Me? Oh, I'm just a cog in the Mercarvian civil service, I'm afraid. I neither sow nor do I reap, in all but the most figurative way. Making things with your hands, though, that's something to be proud of." To illustrate the point, he held out his own hands, palm upwards. They hadn't seen any serious manual work in the past 4 months, at which time they had been calloused from unofficial nocturnal exhumations and necessity of bludgeoning several recalcitrant revenants back into an inanimate state, and then the resulting unofficial nocturnal cremations. Now they looked like the hands of a pencil-pushing administrator who might occasionally do a little gardening in a window box. Herr Roborovsky's unconsciously mimicked Cabal's actions, holding up his hands. Cabal noted that they showed some signs of labor, but, like his own, not recently. While coming to the conclusion that, boring enough, the little man and his irritating wife were just what they appeared to be, Cabal distractedly added, "I mean, all that arcane business with G-clamps, shellac, dovecoat joints, lathes, and such like. Always nice to actually make things with your hands." "It is nice," he agreed, a little mournfully. "In your own time, of course." The one Frau Roborovsky seemed to take exception to building anything that was not for profit. "You have your company to think of." Deciding that her husband was clinically incapable of self-promotion, she said to Cabal and Miss Barrow, "We are hoping to expand into Catamenia. Linus designs are popular there, but having to transport things through Senzo when those brutes insist on dismantling everything, as if one is likely to hide a cannon in a credenza, is costing us money. The intention is to open a workshop in Catamenia and cut out all that Senzen nonsense entirely." Why would one want to hide a cannon in a credenza?" asked Miss Barrow. "Military aid. The Catamenians are barbarians, of course, but they are our historical allies. The Senzens fear a war on 2 fronts and use some silly treaty or another to prevent Catamenia rearming." "Rearming? How did they lose their last lot of weapons?" The Roborovskys looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure Herr Meisner can—" No, Cabal assured Frau Roborovsky. "You're doing a good job." Cornered, she admitted. "There was a war, more of a border dispute, really." Cabal, listening, thought of the many invasions that had started with a trifling border dispute to provide a casus belli that the Senzens blew out of all proportion. The next thing you know, the Catamenians are expected to demobilize all their armed forces and melt down their weapons, just enough for police actions. That's all they were allowed. A disgraceful affront to a nation's sovereignty, a calculated insult to a proud martial tradition. Or a wise victor drawing the teeth of a mad dog, thought Cabal. Accurately, if uncharitably. "Those Senzens think so much of themselves, going around behaving like they own the whole region. They'll even check the records of everybody traveling through their precious territory who hasn't been blessed to be born Senzen to make sure they aren't a threat to national security. They'll search the ship, when we reach Perilla, you know, to make sure we're not desperate anarchists and that none of the crew have been in the military, because they've decided to make that illegal too, because obviously we're going to invade them with a luxury passenger vessel and we're carrying a load of deadly explosive potatoes that we're going to drop on them. They are so stupid." Cabal felt obliged to raise both eyebrows. Potatoes? Calm yourself, my dear, said Herr Roborovsky, dismayed at his wife's outburst. Indeed, such was the depth of her passion that a very, very faint pink, the shade and intensity of a drop of blood on crushed ice, had colored her cheeks. Yes, of course. She reined herself in from the towering heights of fairly annoyed to a simmering peevishness. Eager to change the subject, she said to Miss Barrow, What part of England do you come from, Miss Barrow? The north? Yes, Miss Barrow said, laughing. I know it's a distinctive accent, isn't it? I'm from the northwest, to be exact. The tension broken, the four made small talk. Strictly speaking, only three made small talk, Cabal confining himself to the occasional grunt until the Roborovskys made their apologies and went off to make more new acquaintances. Cabal watched them go, the polite smile he had been keeping on his face by sheer force of will finally allowed to lapse into a faint sneer. Miss Barrow, noticing it, murmured, Now that's more like the Johannes Cabal I know. You know, by conspiring to conceal my identity from the Mercarvians, you're probably committing some heinous crime, according to the comedic document they call a judicial code. Is that a concern for my welfare, I hear? It isn't. No, it's a suggestion that since we both have a lot to lose if my real name is exposed, it might be wise if you could stop blabbing it every few minutes. Stung, she glanced at him. Why couldn't you have decided to be something a bit less troublesome? Herr Meisner, a butcher, or a doctor? There's a difference. Or a children's entertainer, or just something else. For God's sake, Mr. Meisner, why do you do what you do? That, said Cabal, is my business, at which point, with the sharp ringing of a small gong, dinner was announced.